His wife invited him to her wedding as her homeless ex, and he showed up in a Rolls Royce. Not because he wanted to make a scene, not because he was angry or bitter or desperate to prove something to a woman who had already decided what he was worth. He showed up because the wedding venue, the red carpet, the champagne, the chandelier, every square foot of floor his wife's new man had spent 3 years building his future on, belonged to him, had always belonged to him. And the only people in that room who didn't know it were the ones who had spent 12 years making sure he felt like nothing. This is the story of a quiet man, a grandmother's forgotten legacy, and the moment 200 people watched an entire lie collapse in real time inside the building that proved it. What happens when the man you dismissed as homeless turns out to own the ground you're standing on? If you already know where this is going, if you felt something in your chest just reading that, go ahead and hit that like button right now, because this one is going to earn it. Subscribe if you're new here, because we do not waste your time on this channel, and drop your city in the comments, or about tell me where you're watching from today. We've got people tuning in from all over, and I want to know where home is for you. Now let me take you back to where this all started, into a Tuesday morning in a law office on Magazine Street, where a quiet man in a work jacket sat across from his attorney, holding a cream-colored envelope addressed to someone his wife had already decided no longer existed. The envelope had been sitting on Celeste Fontenot's desk since Monday morning, and she had not opened it. That was not her way. Celeste had managed the Dupree Property Trust for 8 years, and in that time she had learned that certain things belonged to Calvin first. So she set it beside his coffee when he arrived, said nothing, and watched him from across her desk, the way a person watches a door they are not sure will hold. Calvin picked it up without hurry. The return address was the Arsenault family restaurant on Magazine Street. No apartment number, no personal address for Calvin anywhere on the front. Just Fontenot Law Group, Suite 214, and his name written in Simone's precise, slanted hand. The kind of handwriting that practiced itself in the mirror. The deliberateness of it was not lost on him. Simone had sent the invitation to his attorney's office because she wanted him to know she believed he had nowhere else to receive mail. That was the first wound, and it was dressed up as an oversight. He opened it anyway. The card inside was cream-colored, heavy stock, printed with gold foil. Simone Arsenault and Armand Toureau. A date, a venue. Maison Dorée, Dauphine Street, Bywater. He read the printed lines once, then found the handwritten note tucked beneath, a folded slip in the same slanted script. For Calvin Dupree. Wanted you to witness this. There's a seat near the back. Come as you are. No judgment. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the desk, smoothed the corner with his thumb, and looked out the window toward the river. Celeste slid her laptop around so he could see the screen without her having to say what was on it. It was a screenshot of a post from a private group. 200 members, most of them people Calvin had sat beside in church, eaten with at somebody's cookout, known by their first names and their mothers' names and the names of their children. The post was from Lisette Arsenault, Simone's cousin, who managed the restaurant's social media with the cheerful aggression of someone who had never once considered that words had weight, even invited the homeless ex. Simone is truly the bigger person. 47 laughing reactions, 3 crying laughing faces in a row, from somebody Calvin used to carpool with to second-line parades. He looked at the screen for exactly as long as it took to understand the full shape of it. Then he looked away. Celeste watched his face the entire time. She had seen Calvin receive bad news before, a property dispute, a contractor who defaulted, the call about his grandmother's health 3 years before Odette passed. She had never once seen him flinch. What she saw now was something quieter than anger and something heavier than hurt. It was the expression of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had just been handed a reason to stop. The office was quiet except for the ceiling fan and the faint sound of a streetcar somewhere on St. Charles. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket and produced a pair of reading glasses, which he put on only to look at the post one more time. Then he took them off and folded them on the desk. He said, "Celeste, the property intake files from the original trust acquisition. Do you still have the photographs?" She did not blink. "All 22 properties." "The one on Dauphine Street in Bywater?" She was already moving to the lateral file cabinet behind her desk, the one with the green label on the third drawer that said Dupree Trust, Acquisition Records. She pulled a manila folder, thicker than it looked, and set it on the desk between them. Calvin opened it. He moved through the photographs with the care of someone who already knew what they were looking for. Property exteriors, interior shots, documentation photos from 2019, the year Odette's estate was formally appraised and transferred. He stopped at a photograph near the back of the stack. It was a wide-angle interior shot of a large hall, plaster walls, tall windows, original hardwood floors that had seen better decades. The room was empty in the photograph except for the dust and a few pieces of furniture left behind by the previous occupant. And there, on the far wall above the empty mantelpiece, was a small oil painting, a woman in a yellow dress, painted in the full confidence of someone who had been loved long enough to stop worrying about how they looked. Odette Dupree, 70 years old in that portrait, 40 years of buying buildings and never selling a single one. Calvin looked at the photograph for a long time. Outside, a cloud shifted, and the late morning light came through the window and caught the edge of the desk, and for a moment the whole office felt like the inside of something about to open. He set the photograph down carefully. He picked up the invitation. He looked at Celeste across the desk with the particular calm of a man who had been underestimated so thoroughly and for so long that he had stopped finding it surprising. Then he slid the invitation across the desk toward her. "Let's move on this." To understand why Calvin Dupree slid that invitation across a desk without a word, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a man who loved a woman with everything he had, and watched her decide, slowly and deliberately, that everything he had was not enough. Calvin met Simone Arsenault on a Sunday after church, the way half of New Orleans met the people they would spend their lives loving or regretting. She was standing outside St. Augustine in a yellow dress with her mother and 2 cousins, laughing at something that had nothing to do with him, and Calvin thought she was the most self-possessed woman he had ever seen. He introduced himself with his hat in his hand, and she gave him her number like she was doing him a favor, and he did not mind that one bit. He was 32 years old, he was patient, he was willing to earn it. And for a while, he did. The first 2 years of the marriage were good in the way that honest things are good, not showy, not theatrical, but solid. Calvin fixed things. That was how he expressed himself. When the window in the bedroom stuck, he rehung it. When the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom dropped, he found the issue before Simone had finished describing it. He cooked on Sundays, red beans, slow on the stove, from Saturday night, cornbread, whatever was in season. He drove her mother to her doctor's appointments without being asked, and never mentioned it afterward. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good husband. Victorine Arsenault did not operate by reasonable measures. Victorine had decided Calvin's worth within 20 minutes of meeting him, and she had never once revisited that decision. He was from the 9th Ward. He had a community college degree and a maintenance background. He drove a sensible truck and wore work boots to occasions that called, in Victorine's estimation, for something more polished. She never said any of this plainly. Victorine was too refined for plain. Instead, she corrected the way he pronounced certain words at dinner, loudly enough for the table to hear. She referred to him as Simone's project in conversations close enough for him to catch if he was paying attention. She asked about his work with the particular careful interest of someone filing information away for later use. She asked about his family property matters once, over a holiday meal, and when Calvin said it was family trust business, Victorine smiled and said, "How sweet that there's something to manage," and moved on to the next topic, like she'd already forgotten him. Calvin heard all of it. He absorbed all of it. His grandmother Odette had raised him with a particular philosophy about dignity, that it was not something other people could grant you and therefore not something other people could take. You either knew what you were worth or you didn't. No amount of condescension could change the number. He carried that like a coat he never had to take off. But Simone was not Odette. Simone had grown up in Victorine's house, at Victorine's table, under Victorine's measuring eye. She had been trained since childhood to read a room, to assess who in it had standing and who did not, and to position herself accordingly. In the early years of the marriage, she kept that instinct in check. She chose Calvin. She defended him sometimes in the small sideways ways available to a woman who did not want to fight her mother directly. Then the defending grew quieter. Then it stopped. By year 4, Simone had begun editing Calvin out of stories. She would describe a trip they took together and say, "I went to," instead of "we went to." She would mention a decision they made jointly and say, "I decided," and watch to see if he noticed. He noticed, he said nothing. By year 6, she stopped bringing him to certain dinners, citing his work schedule even when his schedule was clear. By year 8, she had constructed a version of her life in which Calvin was present in the house, but absent from the narrative. A background figure, infrastructure, something that kept the lights on. Calvin managed the Dupree Trust through all of it. He attended his trustee meetings alone on Tuesday mornings in Celeste Fontenot's office on Poydras Street. He reviewed quarterly reports. He authorized maintenance on the properties, approved lease renewals, managed the accounting with the same steady attention he brought to everything else. When Simone asked where he was going on Tuesday mornings, he told her it was property work for the family estate. She nodded and looked back at whatever she was reading. She had decided long ago that Calvin's world held nothing worth investigating, and that in curiosity was, in its way, the most complete dismissal she ever gave him. He let her keep it. The evening he knew with certainty that the marriage was over, he was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen. Simone was on the phone with her mother, sitting at the kitchen table, with her back to the door, and her voice relaxed in the way it only ever got when she thought she was alone. She said, "I know, Mama, I know, I just think I settled too fast and too low, and now I have to figure out what I'm going to do about it." Calvin stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he walked back to his office, closed the door quietly, and sat down. He did not break anything. He did not raise his voice. He sat with it the way Odette had taught him to sit with hard things. Steady, still, waiting to understand what the thing required of him. He did not know yet that the answer was already in the files on his desk. Armand Toureau walked into the Arsenault family restaurant on a Thursday evening in the 9th year of Calvin and Simone's marriage, and within 45 minutes Victorine Arsenault had laughed more genuinely than Calvin had heard her laugh in nearly a decade of Sunday dinners. That was the thing about Armand. He understood the performance of a room. He knew which compliment to give first, which question to ask second, and when to pause so that the person across from him felt like they had said something worth pausing for. He wore linen in the summer and wool in the winter, and always looked like he had just come from somewhere more interesting than wherever he currently was. He talked about his new venue project in Bywater with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered that it might not work out, because men like Armand, in rooms like the Arsenault dining room, were never asked to consider that. He called the project Maison Dorée, Gold House. He said it with the particular pride of a man who had named something and believed the name made it real. Simone started attending his soft opening events that spring. She went the first time with Victorine and 2 of her cousins, and she came home that evening lighter than she had been in months, talking about the exposed brick and the pendant lighting, and how Armand had personally recommended a wine she had never tried before. Calvin was sitting at the kitchen table going through trust paperwork when she came in. He looked up. She did not ask what he was working on. She set her purse on the counter and kept talking about the wine. He went back to the paperwork. Over the months that followed, Maison Dorée became a topic of conversation in the Arsenault family, the way certain things became topics, slowly at first, then all at once. Simone and Victorine went to 3 more events. Armand came to the restaurant twice for dinner, and both times the bill was on the house, which Victorine authorized herself without consulting anyone. By autumn, Simone was describing Armand's vision to her cousins with the fluency of someone who had been hearing about it for a long time and had decided it was worth believing in. The investment conversation happened over lunch between Simone and her mother at a corner table at the restaurant on a Tuesday, when Calvin was at a trustee meeting on Poydras Street. The Arsenault family put in $45,000. Simone brokered it. She signed the paperwork with her maiden name, Arsenault, not Dupré, and she never mentioned it to Calvin. Not that evening, not any evening after. The first Maison Dorée lease payment to the Dupré Property Trust cleared that same October. Calvin saw Armand Turreau's name in the tenant ledger at his next quarterly review. He noted it. He said nothing to Celeste beyond what was procedurally required, and nothing to Simone at all. He was a trustee. It was his business to know who occupied his properties. It was not his habit to explain that business to people who had decided it was beneath their interest. The Christmas gathering at Maison Dorée was Victorine's idea. She wanted to see the space in full, she said, to understand what the family's investment looked like, dressed up and lit. Armand opened the venue for the occasion, brought in catering, strung warm light across the ceiling. It was a beautiful room. Calvin could see that. Odette had known how to choose buildings the way some people knew how to choose music, for the feeling of them, not just the function. He was standing near the far wall with a glass of eggnog when Simone's cousin Darlene stopped beside him and pointed at the portrait above the mantelpiece. It was a small oil painting, maybe 18 inches across. A woman in a yellow dress, seated, her hands folded in her lap, with the ease of someone who had long since stopped being anxious about what anyone thought of her. 70 years old in that portrait, painted by a student at Xavier University who had done it in exchange for 2 months of free studio space in one of Odette's Trem properties. Darlene said, "That is a beautiful painting. Armand, where'd you get that?" Armand was across the room with a champagne flute. He called back without looking. "Came with the building. Some estate had it. I liked the energy." Calvin looked at his grandmother's face. He looked at the particular way the painter had caught the light on her collarbone and the slight forward lean of her posture that meant she was paying attention to something just outside the frame. He looked at her hands, which he had held at her kitchen table in the 9th Ward for 30 years of Sunday mornings. and which had signed the deed to this building and 21 others with those same steady fingers. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "Excuse me," to no one in particular, and went to find a refill. The divorce papers arrived in February. Simone's attorney filed a financial disclosure, arguing that Calvin Dupree held no significant assets, no real property, no investment accounts, no holdings of consequence. Simone had reviewed the filing herself and signed off on it. She believed it completely. It had never occurred to her to verify something she had already decided was true. Victorine began telling the story about the same week. Calvin had lost everything in the settlement, she said. He was staying with somebody, doing odd jobs. You know how it goes with some men. They just don't have the foundation. The story moved through the church directory and the Saturday morning regulars and the cousins group, chat with the efficiency of something that confirmed what people already half believed. Lisette put it in writing. By March, the wedding date was set. The invitations were printed on cream cardstock with gold foil. The venue was booked, Maison Dorée, Dauphine Street, Bywater. 200 guests, and somewhere near the bottom of the guest list, in the section Lisette had captioned with her particular brand of cheerful cruelty, was the name Calvin Dupree. They were completely certain he was nothing. They had never been more wrong about anything in their lives. 2 days after the invitation arrived, Calvin Dupree sat down in Celeste Fontenot's office and asked her to lay everything out. Not because he didn't know what was there. He had known for 8 years exactly what was there. He had reviewed every quarterly report, approved every lease renewal, signed every trustee document that came across Celeste's desk with the same steady hand he used for everything else. The Dupree Property Trust was not a mystery to Calvin. It was a responsibility. It was the thing Odette had left him, and the thing he had tended the way she had taught him to tend things. Quietly, consistently, without announcing it to rooms full of people who wouldn't understand it anyway. But he needed to hear it said aloud today. He needed to sit across from Celeste and have her put the full shape of it on the table between them, because what he was considering required clarity, not the cloudy clarity of grief or wounded pride. The clean clarity of a man who understood exactly what he held and exactly what he intended to do with it. Celeste opened the master portfolio without ceremony. 22 properties, the Trem, Bywater, Mid-City, Central City, and 2 parcels in the 7th Ward that Odette had held since 1987 when no one else wanted them. Combined appraised value as of the most recent independent assessment, $19,700,000. Monthly rental income across all active leases, $87,000. The trust had carried no debt since 2021. It was, in Celeste's measured professional opinion, one of the most soundly structured private property trusts she had administered in 30 years of estate law. Calvin nodded. He had heard these numbers before. He was waiting for the specific number. Celeste pulled a second folder, thinner, a single lease agreement on top, 3 years of payment records beneath it. Tenant, Armand Thureau, operating as Maison Dorée Events, LLC. Property, 1418 Dauphine Street, Bywater. Monthly lease rate, $6,800. Lease commencement, 38 months ago. Status, current. Every payment received on time, not 1 month in arrears. Celeste set the folder down and folded her hands. She said, "He's paid this trust $258,400 over the life of this lease." She paused to let that number settle. "All of it to you." Calvin looked at the lease agreement for a long moment. He thought about Armand Thureau at the Arsenault family restaurant, holding a champagne flute and talking about neighborhood prestige. He thought about the way Simone had come home from those soft openings with a lightness that had nothing to do with him. He thought about the Christmas gathering and the portrait and the easy way Armand had said it came with the building, part of some estate sale, without ever once considering whose estate that might have been or whose name was on the deed. He had paid the man he was replacing every month for 3 years, $6,800 made out to the Dupree Property Trust, which was Calvin, which had always been Calvin, which Armand Thureau had never bothered to investigate because men like Armand did not investigate things they considered beneath them. The irony of it was almost architectural. Celeste turned to the third document in the folder without being asked. It was a compilation she had prepared the previous evening, a cross-reference of Maison Doré's published event calendar against the venue's permitted maximum occupancy of 140 guests, as specified in Section 7C of the lease agreement Armand had signed. 3 events, a charity gala in October, a private corporate dinner in January, a cultural showcase in March. All 3 had been publicly promoted with guest counts ranging from 180 to 210. All 3 had been documented through social media posts, ticketing records, and Maison Doré's own website as exceeding the permitted capacity by a significant margin. Armand had signed Section 7C himself. His initials were on the margin beside the capacity clause. He had signed it, and then, in the manner of a man who considered fine print someone else's concern, he had never looked at it again. Celeste said, "The violations are documented, they're not manufactured, they're not ambiguous. Any competent attorney looking at this file would reach the same conclusion in under an hour." She set the document down with the precision of someone placing a final piece. The termination clause is airtight. Calvin picked up the original intake photograph from the acquisition file, the one he had looked at in this same office 2 days ago, the one he had asked Celeste to pull before he had said another word. He held it beside the lease document. In the background of the intake photo, above what was then an empty mantelpiece in an empty hall, was the small oil portrait, the woman in the yellow dress, painted in the full confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove: his grandmother's building, his grandmother's portrait, his grandmother's tenant, who had spent 3 years writing checks to his grandmother's trust while planning a wedding to humiliate her grandson. The slow burn was over. Calvin set the photograph down. He looked at Celeste across the desk, and the expression on his face was not anger, it was not triumph. It was the particular settled calm of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had just confirmed that the patience was about to pay exactly what he had always believed it would. He said, "It wasn't the money that made me wait, it was never the money." Celeste said nothing. She knew when to let him finish. "It was the invitation," he said. She made the choice. "I'm just going to honor it." He stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "Let's get to work." The difference between justice and noise, Celeste had told Calvin once, is precision. Anyone can be angry, anyone can make a scene. But a scene fades, precision compounds. It was the same philosophy Odette Dupré had applied to 40 years of buying buildings. Not the loudest bid, not the most dramatic offer, just the right move at the right moment, executed cleanly and without hesitation. Calvin had been Odette's student long before he was her trustee. They met the morning after his decision in Celeste's office, the city still cool outside, the ceiling fan turning slow overhead. Celeste had the lease agreement open on her desk and the capacity violation documentation beside it, and she walked Calvin through the mechanism with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. The termination clause in Section 12B of the lease was unambiguous. 3 documented violations of the occupancy limit constituted grounds for immediate termination with 30 days' notice. No court appearance required, No negotiation required. The clause existed because Celeste had drafted it that way 8 years ago when Odette's portfolio was first formalized. Drafted it that way for every single lease in the trust because Celeste believed that a well-written contract was a form of protection, and protection, like real estate, was worth investing in properly. Armand Turod had signed it. His initials were in the margin, Section 12B, initialed and dated the way a man initials things he does not intend to read. Calvin asked about the timing. Celeste laid it out. The wedding was 22 days from Tuesday. If the termination notice was filed that morning, Armand would receive it by Wednesday at the latest. 22 days meant the notice would expire on the wedding day itself, which meant the event was legally scheduled inside a property whose lease had already been terminated. That was not a technicality. That was the entire structure of a building coming down at once. 22 days also meant that Armand had long since spent the deposits from every event booked at Maison Dorée between now and the end of the quarter. Those deposits, Calvin had reviewed the booking calendar Celeste had obtained through standard trustee records, totaled just over $74,000. Spent by all indicators on the renovation debt Armand had been quietly carrying since the second year of his lease. Calvin said, "The notice goes under trust letterhead only." Celeste nodded. She had already prepared it that way. The document read, "Dupree Property Trust through Council hereby provides notice of lease termination. No first name, no last name, no Calvin Dupree anywhere on the page. Just the trust, the clause, the violations documented by date, and the certified mail stamp." Armand Turod would receive a letter from an entity he had been paying for 3 years without ever investigating. He would call his attorney would read the clause, review the documented violations, and tell him what Celeste had already confirmed, that the termination was airtight. There was no counter-argument available to a man who had signed the clause, violated it 3 times on public record, and never once thought to ask who owned the building he was in. The secondary move was standard trustee procedure. Celeste contacted Maison Doré's commercial insurance carrier, flagging the active lease dispute as a material change in the property's legal status. This was a notification requirement under the trust's own insurance obligations, completely routine, fully documentable, the kind of thing that happened every time a lease dispute arose on any of the trust's 22 properties. The insurance carrier would make its own decision from there. Calvin did not direct that decision. He did not need to. The final 2 details were his alone. He called a man named Gerald Broussard, who ran a car service out of Mid-City and had been detailing and driving Calvin's personal vehicles for 6 years. He arranged for the Navy Cullinan to be at the front entrance of Maison Dorée on the morning of the wedding with Gerald in a proper uniform. Front entrance only. Not the side lot. Not the service entrance. The foot of the red-carpeted steps at the ceremony hour. Then Calvin sent 3 text messages. One to his old friend Darnell, who had known him since they were both at John McDonough High School, and who remained to this day a man whose word and whose presence in a room carried weight. One to Paulette, who sang with the choir at St. Augustine and knew everyone within a 2-mile radius of Magazine Street. One to Bernard, who coached youth basketball and had attended every significant event in their community for the past 15 years. The message was identical to all 3. "I'll be at the Maison Dorée event on Saturday. Thought you should know. No explanation, no preview, no drama. Just the information planted quietly in the right places, the way Odette had once planted a purchase offer in the right hands at the right moment, trusting that the right people would understand its significance when the time came." Celeste filed the termination notice at exactly 9:04 on Tuesday morning via certified mail Return receipt requested. By 9:11, it was in the hands of the Postal Service. By 9:15, Calvin and Celeste were walking down Poydras Street toward the cafe on the corner, where Calvin ordered café au lait and Celeste ordered black coffee, and neither of them said a single word about what had just been set in motion. There was nothing left to say. The work was done. Armand Toureau's Tuesday, however, was just getting started. The letter arrived at Maison Dorée on a Wednesday morning. Armand Toureau signed for it himself. He stood at the front door of his venue in a linen shirt with a coffee in his hand, and he read the first paragraph twice because the first time he read it, he thought he had misunderstood something. He had not misunderstood anything. The Dupree Property Trust, through counsel, was formally notifying him of lease termination pursuant to Section 12B. 3 documented capacity violations, 30 days' notice, effective immediately upon receipt. He called his attorney before he finished the second page. His attorney called him back within the hour. The conversation was short. The violations were documented. The clause was clear. The initials in the margin were Armand's own. There was no counter-argument available to him. His attorney's exact words were, "Armand, you signed it. I need you to understand that you signed it." Armand went very quiet after that call. Day 2, the insurance carrier sent its own letter. Active lease dispute. Material change in property status. Event coverage suspended pending resolution. Armand could not legally host a ticketed or contracted event inside Maison Dorée until the dispute was resolved or a new lease was executed. There would be no new lease. Days 3 through 5 arrived like a hammer, striking the same nail repeatedly. The first event cancellation came from a corporate client whose attorney had reviewed the insurance suspension and advised them to pull out. The deposit was non-refundable per contract, but the client threatened litigation anyway, and Armand's attorney told him quietly that defending a lawsuit right now was not something he could afford. The second cancellation came before noon on day 4. The third and fourth by end of business. By day 5, 6 events had cancelled. $74,000 in deposits. Money Armand had already moved to cover the renovation debt on the back bar, and the kitchen expansion was now owed back to clients he could not pay. His phone stopped being a tool and became a source of dread. Day 6 was a Sunday. The Arsenault family gathered for dinner at the restaurant on Magazine Street the way they did every Sunday, and by the time the bread pudding came out, Simone had explained the situation to her father and her aunt, and 3 of her cousins who had invested smaller amounts alongside the family's $45,000. The table went the kind of quiet that precedes something loud. Harland Arsenault Sr. asked one question. "Simone, did you vet this man's lease before you put our money in?" Simone said the deal had looked solid. Harland said, "Audit, that is not what I asked you." The staff moved the family to the private room before the conversation reached its full volume. It did not help much. The kitchen could still hear it. Day 8. Victorine called Simone from her personal line, the one she used only for things she did not want going through the restaurant phone. She said, in the particular register she reserved for final pronouncements, "This is what happens when you let a man talk you into things your family didn't approve." Simone pointed out that Victorine had been the one who had approved of Armand most loudly and most publicly. The call ended without resolution. They did not speak again for several days. Armand, by day 8, had stopped answering his phone entirely. Day 10. Lisette made the mistake of leaving the original post up. Calvin's 3 text messages had done their quiet work. Darnell had mentioned to 2 people that Calvin would be at the Saturday event. Paulette had mentioned it to 4. Bernard had said nothing to anyone, but had listened carefully when 3 separate people in his orbit mentioned, unprompted, that something strange was happening with Maison Dorée and that nobody seemed to know who actually owned the building. The private group chat where Lisette had posted her laughing caption began filling with a new kind of comment. People who had seen the homeless ex post were now asking questions. The questions did not have answers yet, but the questions themselves were damaging. Someone commented, Wait, didn't I hear Calvin was going to be there Saturday?" The post had 47 laughing reactions. By day 10 it had 12 new comments, and none of them were laughing. Day 15. Armand's contractor, a man named Thibodeau, who had done the back bar renovation on a payment plan that Armand had already missed twice, filed a lien against the property. The lien was public record. It appeared in the parish records within 48 hours. 2 people texted Simone screenshots before she had finished her morning coffee. Day 20 arrived cold and clear. Simone called Calvin at 9:30 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. She spoke for nearly 3 minutes. She explained the situation with the lease. She explained that she had spoken to Armand's attorney and her own attorney, and that there seemed to be some kind of dispute with the property trust. She said she needed Calvin to reach out to whoever owned the building and see if something could be worked out. Her voice was controlled for the first 2 minutes. By the 3rd minute, it had begun to fray at the edges like fabric pulled too hard in one direction. Calvin let her finish. The line was quiet for a moment after she stopped speaking. Then he said, "I own the building, Simone." 4 seconds of silence followed that were the loudest 4 seconds of the entire 20 days. Simone said very quietly, "What did you say?" Calvin said, "You heard me." She demanded they speak in person. She said Saturday. She said Maison Dorée. Calvin said that worked fine for him. He already had a valet arranged. The morning of the wedding, Maison Dorée was dressed for a celebration it would never complete. The chandeliers were lit. The champagne was on ice. White florals ran the length of the hall in arrangements that had cost more than some people's monthly rent, and the red carpet at the front entrance had been rolled out before 8 in the morning by a staff that did not yet know the lease on the building had expired at midnight. 180 guests filled the hall in their finest. The women in color, the men in suits, the whole room carrying the particular electric energy of people who had come to witness something they believed would be remarkable. They were right. They just had the story wrong. Armand Toureau stood near the ceremony arch in a cream linen suit that had cost him $3,000. He had not slept well. His attorney had called the night before to confirm one final time that there was no legal remedy available before the morning. Armand had thanked him and hung up and stood in his apartment for a long time, staring at a wall. Now he was here, in the venue that no longer belonged to him in any meaningful sense, wearing a suit he couldn't truly afford, waiting for a wedding that had already been cracked at the foundation by a letter from a trust he had never once investigated. Victorine and Lisette sat in the front row. Victorine wore pearl earrings and a church expression, composed, imperial, the look of a woman who had decided that public stillness was the last form of control available to her. Lisette sat beside her with her phone in her lap, which she had been checking every 3 minutes since arriving. The navy Rolls-Royce Cullinan pulled to a stop at the foot of the red-carpeted steps at precisely 11 o'clock. Gerald held the door. Calvin stepped out. The charcoal Tom Ford suit was impeccable, not flashy, not costumed, just the precise, unhurried presentation of a man who had decided once and for all to stop making himself small for other people's comfort. Celeste Fontenot stepped out behind him, leather portfolio under her arm, in a deep burgundy blazer that meant business in the most elegant possible way. Calvin handed his keys to Gerald without looking, and turned toward the steps. The crowd at the entrance went silent, the way rooms go silent when something irrevocable is about to happen. Lisette's mimosa hit the floor. Victorine's hand found her husband's arm and gripped it. Someone in the middle of the crowd said, barely above a whisper, "Is that Calvin?" And someone else said nothing, just raised their phone. Then 3 more phones went up. Then a dozen. Calvin walked up the steps without hurrying. He did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not look for reactions. He moved through the entrance of the building the way a man moves through a door he owns, which is to say, without asking permission from anyone. Inside, the room divided itself between those who understood immediately what was happening and those who were still trying to figure it out. Calvin walked to the center of the hall and stopped. He looked up. Odette's portrait was still on the wall above the mantelpiece, exactly where it had been at the Christmas gathering 3 years ago, exactly where it had been in the intake photograph taken 8 years before that. The woman in the yellow dress looked back at him with the same patient expression she had worn her entire life. Forward lean, folded hands, paying attention. Calvin looked at her for a long moment. Then the doors to the bridal suite opened, and Simona stepped out. She was in her wedding dress. She was beautiful in it, the way she was always beautiful, precisely, deliberately, with great effort, concealed. She saw Calvin standing in the center of her wedding hall in a suit that cost more than she had believed he could afford, and she went very still. The room held its breath. Calvin spoke in a voice that was completely, almost impossibly, calm. He said he was not there to cause a scene. He said he wanted to correct a few things that had been said about him in this community by people in this room, and he wanted to do it here because here was the appropriate place. He said that for 12 years he had been called a handyman, a project, a man without foundation. He said that his name had been put on an invitation addressed to a lawyer's office because his own wife had told 200 people that he didn't have a current address. He paused. He said, "I want to show you all something." He looked at Armand directly for the first time. He said, "You have been writing a check every month for 3 years to the Dupree Property Trust, $6,800 every month on time. To a trust you never investigated because you decided the name on the deed wasn't worth your attention." He let that sit for 3 full seconds. "That trust is mine. It has been mine since my grandmother Odette died 8 years ago. You have been paying me, Armand, while you were planning your life with my wife." Armand opened his mouth. Celeste opened the portfolio and held up the lease agreement, turned outward to the room. Armand's name at the top, his initials in the margin beside section 12B, his signature at the bottom. Armand closed his mouth. Calvin turned to Simona. He said it quietly, the way you say something you have waited a long time to say and have no need to shout. "You told 200 people I was homeless, Simone. You couldn't even put a real address on my invitation. But what you didn't know was that the deed to this building, the walls your guests are standing in, the floor your dress is touching right now, all of it belongs to my grandmother's trust, and I am the trust. You planned your whole new life inside my property. So no, I won't be sitting in the back. I own every seat in this room." Simone did not cry immediately. She understood first. The understanding moved across her face like weather. Slow, inevitable, total. She understood the Christmas gathering. She understood the portrait. She understood 3 years of monthly checks and Tuesday morning meetings and a man who had sat across from her at dinner and said it was family property business, and she had never once thought to ask what that meant. She understood that she had spent 12 years dismissing the most consequential man in her life. The tears came after the understanding. They always do. Victorine Arsenault, who had not been silent in a room in 12 years of family gatherings and church functions and restaurant dinners, sat down in her front row chair and said absolutely nothing. It was the loudest thing she had ever done. Calvin walked to the mantelpiece. He lifted Odette's portrait carefully from the wall, both hands, the way you carry something precious, and tucked it under his arm. He walked to the front entrance without looking back. He did not say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. The work was done. The truth was in the room. And the building that had held it all, his grandmother's building, his building, the building Armand Toureau had signed a lease on without reading, stood exactly as it always had. Calvin Dupree walked out the front door into the New Orleans morning and did not look back. The building emptied in 20 minutes. The building emptied in 20 minutes, just as Calvin had known it would. The guests filed out in the particular stunned quiet of people who had witnessed something they would be describing for the rest of their lives. The champagne sat untouched in its ice. The florals stayed on their stands. And Maison Dorée, which had never truly belonged to Armand Toureau in any way that mattered, stood empty on Dauphine Street in the Bywater afternoon and waited to become what it had always been, a Dupree property. Armand was gone from New Orleans in 60 days. The contractor's lien was filed and enforced, and whatever equity Armand had imagined he was building in Maison Dorée dissolved the way smoke dissolves, completely, without residue. His attorney advised him to settle, to vacate, and to begin somewhere else. He took that advice. The movers came on a Thursday. By Friday, his apartment was empty. By the following Saturday, 3 people who had considered him a rising figure in New Orleans cultural life had already stopped mentioning his name. The Arsenault family never recovered the $45,000. Harland Sr. hired an attorney of his own to pursue recovery, but the money had been spent, the lease was terminated, and the legal path forward was long and expensive and uncertain. After 2 consultation fees and a letter that went unanswered, Harland let it go in the way that proud men let things go, without saying so out loud, but with a permanent change in his expression whenever Simone's name came up at the dinner table. Victorine's standing in the community shifted in the slow, irreversible way that reputations shift when the truth arrives publicly, and the people who were laughing find themselves suddenly very quiet. She still came to church on Sundays. She still sat in her customary pew. But the women who had once leaned in close to hear her pronouncements now found somewhere else to be during the fellowship hour. The community had seen the receipts, they had watched the post, they had been in that room or known someone who was, and the version of Calvin Dupree that Victorine had spent months constructing had been demolished in under 10 minutes by the man himself in his own building without raising his voice. Simone found that the social world she had carefully constructed over 12 years was thinner than it had appeared. Much of what she had called her standing had been, in reality, the goodwill the community extended to Calvin, the quiet respect people have for a man who shows up and does what he says and never makes himself anyone's problem. When Calvin was no longer beside her, that goodwill did not transfer. It stayed where it had always belonged. Her event coordination work at the restaurant contracted. 2 outside clients did not renew. She was still Simone Arsenault. But the room no longer leaned toward her the way it once had, and she felt the difference every single day. The Dupree Property Trust converted Maison Dorée within 4 months. Celeste handled the renovation contracts. Calvin oversaw the structural decisions the way he oversaw everything, by showing up, asking the right questions, and trusting the people he had hired to do the work they were hired to do. The back bar that Armand had renovated on debt became a community kitchen for pop-up food vendors. The main hall, with its high windows and original hardwood floors, became a free or subsidized event space available to black-owned small businesses, community organizations, and neighborhood non-profits. The booking calendar filled up within 3 weeks of the announcement. Calvin named it the Odette Dupree Cultural Hall. At the opening, a local photographer took a picture that circulated widely in the community. Calvin standing in the center of the main hall in a simple dark jacket, no tie, hands folded in front of him the same way his grandmother folded hers in the portrait. And behind him, above the mantelpiece, Odette's portrait hung on the wall where it had always been, now in a proper frame with a small brass plate beneath it that read, Odette Celeste Dupree, 1942 to 2016. This building was hers first. It was the truest sentence Calvin had ever commissioned. He met Renée Baptiste 2 months after the opening at a Dupree Trust board meeting where she was presenting a greening proposal for 2 of the mid-city properties. She was a landscape architect, calm, direct, with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had long since stopped trying to impress rooms and had started simply being useful to them. She asked Calvin after the meeting whether the woman in the portrait had ever kept a garden because whoever had planted the courtyard on the Dauphine Street property had known exactly what they were doing. Calvin told her that Odette had kept fig trees and that she had believed firmly, with the certainty of someone who had been right about most things, that you could tell a person's character by whether or not they tended what they planted. Renée said that she agreed. Calvin said that he did too. And that was all, just 2 people standing in a doorway after a meeting, talking about a woman neither of them had stopped thinking about, and the particular quality of late afternoon light in New Orleans when the heat has just broken, and the city smells like rain is coming, and everything feels, briefly, like exactly what it is. Because that is the thing about real power. It does not announce itself. It does not require an audience or a reaction or 47 laughing reactions in a group chat of people who should have known better. It simply exists, patient, documented, and fully intact, until the moment the room goes quiet enough to hear it. Calvin Dupree had always known what he was worth. He had simply waited for everyone else to catch up. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were Calvin in that moment, standing in that hall with the portrait above you and 200 people watching, what would you have done differently? Would you have walked in the same way? Said the same things? Or would you have made a different choice entirely? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, if you felt that moment in your chest when Calvin said he owned every seat in the room, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for stories like this to find the people who need them. And if you are new here, this is what we do on this channel. We tell the stories of people who were underestimated, dismissed, and written off, and we watch what happens when the truth finally arrives. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story is already waiting, and I promise you, it is worth every minute. I will see you in the next one.